Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our AMA with Travis and Peter. We're very excited for everyone to be here. You will see in your chat that there is a posted message about sending any questions you may have for Travis or Peter directly to the chat. So we're just going to be getting them set up really quick, and then we will get started in just a few minutes or so. Thank you so much for joining.
Can you hear me, Peter? Your mic's not working?
Oh, how about this? Is this
Yep,
okay?
I can hear you.
Okay. For some reason it was just it was red. I don't know.
All right, everyone, we are all good to go. Thank you so much for joining us. Travis and Peter, I will let you take it away.
Great, thanks. Well, it's good to be with Peter again. Peter, hello. Thanks for joining.
Hey, Travis.
I always look forward to having a chance to talk with you. And I think this is basically an open-ended conversation, maybe continuing off of our previous conversation and then letting, steering by questions from anybody that comes. But I think there'll be, several, I get several times people's questions about, I've got this open source project. How do I fund it? And it comes in different ways. We want to talk about, turning open source into a sustainable business. And there's different ways to think about that, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe we can just talk about some of the constraints, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. And I think one of the questions I would ask somebody who's asking about turning my open source into a sustainable business is, first of all, well, how do you want to do that? Like, do you want to work someplace that is able to do that? Do you want to start a company? Do you want to? I mean, there's basically different implications, because so maybe we could talk just briefly, kind of about the different approaches people have taken to doing businesses around open source. Maybe that's a starting point. I don't know, Peter. What else? What do you
Yeah.
think?
No, I think that's I think we should look at the different ways one can do this, and in doing so, maybe tease out and separate the concerns that get wrapped up together,
Yeah,
right? In this
exactly.
topic, because I think exactly as you say. Well, if you really care about sustaining open source development, if a project only has one developer, then it's about
Right.
having that developer being meaningfully employed somewhere, or is it
Right.
work-life
Exactly.
balance? What is it?
Exactly.
But one thing I would maybe just say before we get started in looking at the different kinds of models is that what we can look for is this idea. A thing that I found to be really important to point out is that when we in open source community software communities that get together around a piece of code or a problem area that we enjoy kind of working on together with other people, like-minded folks, we are essentially applying our time and applying our expertise um, in the direction and service of certain values. And those are maybe technical values or human values, what have you. The SciPy community, of course, started with an aspect of that, right? It was in service of science. And many people cared about that. But there's values there that are oftentimes very different than the values when you have a big company that's pulled together as a business. Its values are very, very commercial oriented. It may have a thesis about the world and some vision and all these things, but ultimately, software developers employed in businesses or even making code that's sold to businesses, that code or their labors, the technical labors, are in service of different values. And so I just want to, as we're looking at this, maybe keep this kind of concept or this little framework in mind of when, how aligned is a particular or how much of a person's energy and expertise is being devoted in service of the values that they and that open source community care about, versus what makes money for them. And I think that's a fundamental. Doesn't have to be intention, but it oftentimes is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So maybe we can just briefly kind of talk about our specific journeys. I know people have heard them before, but maybe summarize quickly about this particular question as it relates to our, my perspective. Like I
Mhm.
had one perspective on this, let's say 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
Mhm.
Essentially I was in academia. And so my career was a professor and researcher being paid by the university, teach classes and do research, right? And then I had in building that program, first of all, before I even was a professor, I was a student working in
Mhm.
that same system. That was a student in that system and participating in that approach to funding research, right? And so in that context is where I had some time because there's a lot of freedom as an academic to explore and decide and I needed tools to do the research I was doing. So then I started to participate in open source ecosystems as a part of that academic study. And that led to, and I think this has certainly played out with many, many other people as well. There's
Right.
some time to spend on tools. And so then I did. With other people, I started to spend time on tools. Eventually, the point where like, okay, these tools are interesting and they need some more support, and I want to figure out how to do them more. So that's what led me to the question of, well, is this just for an academic exercise? Essentially, all open source going to, and this is not true, but certainly a big fraction of open source code is done inside of research organizations,
Right.
basically who are funded by academic, funded by grants, funded by other, educational pursuits. I I don't want to ignore that. I think it's actually really important and a really good foundation for a lot of early stage activity and innovative activity. What I noticed is that there was only a certain amount of effort I could put. Like you could put things out. We had a community of people gathered, and they could kind of produce certain kinds of modules. But then sustaining those for a long period of time, like I would pull time to. I would fund a graduate student. Essentially, I ended up publishing a book to try to get money. I'd maybe
Mhm.
put them on a grant. Like one of the challenges is in that space, there really isn't a place to fund open source. There's a space to put you can put on your grant licenses for MATLAB, licenses for IDL, licenses for a software package I'm going to buy. But it so far isn't very common to put develop open source as part of the grant application, where instead of just licenses for a fund for a proprietary application. That was one of the challenges we faced. Okay, how do I actually get time to spend on this? That for me was a big deal. I wanted to actually learn how to do this, how to do entrepreneurship and business. So I
Mhm.
was interested in that enough to make the leap, to not just continue to pursue academic funding. Now I've got lots of friends who have stayed in the academic funding world, and
Mhm.
that's totally fine. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think from the very beginning, it's like, well, there's opportunities in the place you are to direct funding to your project that you want, right? And I think
Right.
that gets to, that is always an option, right? You're working someplace, getting funding for developing open source the place you work, and that has a particular story in academia. It also has a story in an organization, and now at this point, we've both been part of small organizations, mid-sized organizations, and then we've worked for very big organizations
Mhm.
and done contracting and consulting with big organizations. So we can kind of speak to the opportunities that are there to direct funding from different organizations to open source. I think I want to make sure we don't, just paper over that opportunity, because I think it is it's practically what's been happening in a lot of places. It's growing, and it could use additional, I guess, thoughtful conversation as people. So that's just so that gives a little bit of story of why I'm here from academia. Ended up wanting to do entrepreneurship, went the entrepreneurship route. I would say definitely that took a lot of brain cycles. There are things I did that were not participating in open source, but instead organizing business. And that has consequences. Some of that's good. Some of that's you have to make a decision as a person as to what you want to pursue in your time. Essentially, there's a lot of managing other people besides just developers, right?
Right.
And or just your own self, getting time for yourself to work on the project you care about. And so that is, and I can speak more to what I've tried to do to make that easier for others. That's essentially one of my goals right now, is to make that easier for other people to make that choice without having to, spend time thinking about how to hire teams, how to sell, how to market, how to actually take any of that experience I've gained and try to provide it to other people. That's definitely one of the things I've been trying to do for the past 4 or 5 years. I can talk more about that, but I think that's a specific question. What about you, Peter? What's your observation over you have a similar background, I would say. I mean, you started in, you got involved in open source as an academic, but then you went to industry pretty, early. and then participated in several. Then we founded, we worked several places together. We worked in a place together, and we founded a company together. And then since then, you've been, watching that grow and doing many things with lots of other companies too. So I'd love to hear your perspective, kind of how it's emerged.
Yeah, I think I was involved in open as a user of open source for many years before I myself got involved in the contribution aspect. And when I did, it was on the basis of having been a lurker, right, for well over a decade. I think probably 15 years or so before I started really getting involved. Maybe 10 years before I started really getting involved as a contributor. And it was in the early days, I think, before a lot of other social valences and even job search sort of stuff got loaded onto it. It was really a very much a it was an indigenous culture, if we will, indigenous culture of the early internet, right?
Yeah,
And
that's a good
and
metaphor.
yeah, and I think there's something to that. We don't have to, get into that right now, but I think there's a thing about that I was very lucky, I think, to have had the opportunity to spend so much time watching people, seeing what was happening, learning, chiming in here and there, but otherwise, learning a lot about kind of the ethos and the norms of what it meant to be a contributor in a highly technical environment. Really gaining respect for the kind of artifacts that were being produced by these collaborations. But anyway, when I started getting involved in the scientific Python community, Travis, you're already kind of well steeped in it at the time. I was never really an academic. I sort of bailed early, right out of undergrad. I went into doing software development.
A little smarter than most. No.
Well, that's too kind. No, there are a lot of really talented people in universities,
Yes,
and
that's true.
and part of the effort of what we do, in this scientific computing realm, was we did a lot of the grunt work so those other people could be freed up to do the important sciences and the important kind of analyses that they needed to do to advance their fields. So I think this, going through that, and then the consulting years that you and I had at Enthought, those were very interesting times. Learned so much about how software development is managed at scale in businesses. Yeah, and I think it's important for my personal journey. It was important that I never worked at one of those big companies. I only worked at startups and smaller companies. And the reason I think is because that allowed me to be very close in small teams that were working with a somewhat unified vision, purpose, a particular thesis about what could be done with technology and service a particular problem. And I think if I had spent 10 years grinding away as part of a multi-100-person big corporate dev thing, I think I would have lost my love for software development. So for me, I was never part of like the music factory. I was always part of jam bands, or something like that. And we're busking and doing things like that. You stay close to the music and you're playing in front of a small audience. It's, like when comedians talk about, sometimes I see these things and they're talking about working a small club. And that's where the art of comedy really originates, is in that relationship with the audience. I think in any kind of craft, there is this thing about being close to the problem, close to the user or the receiver of your craft, and really having that lets you develop the empathy and the kind of a relational way of knowing and building. When you get into these giant sort of organizations, you lose track of that, and there are internal. They're more guided by their internal dynamics and oftentimes politics than they are by first class kind of contact with the outside world. And this is important, I think, for open source, however it is funded, because ultimately the open source, the point of the openness is to allow many people to go and permissionlessly build new and different things on top of what currently exists. And that permissionless thing is so important. Now, the problem is if the people can take this thing and they have permission to go do interesting things with it and they don't, well, there's nothing you can really put into the thing to make them be more creative. You can't sell a box of crayons that makes someone into like a Van Gogh. That'd be a pretty expensive box of crayons, right? But at least you could sell them an art toolkit that doesn't prevent them from making certain kinds of art. And I think with open source software, we build these pieces, we build these tools, and that freedom to innovate and create sort of was always a key part of the ethos of it, regardless of licensing, cost, any of this stuff.
Yes, I'd like to dig in a little bit there in terms of, I think one of the challenges is let's take open source and business, right? And they are different. They're not opposed to each other. They're just different framings of human cooperation. Is what I look at it. Like open source is about permission to develop onto. It's voluntary, kind of come together. It's unstructured in some sense. It doesn't require a formal legal conversations. What you enable is people working together across time and scale. That's really unprecedented in some sense, right? There's these essentially cooperative projects that break across multiple jurisdictions and cultures. It becomes a shared ethos. Now, business, on the other hand, is something that fits very much in jurisdictions, in mechanisms of trade. So for me, they're very separate. Like, to make a business, you have to be selling something, and you have to be selling something. And so, what are you selling? That's the first question when you come to a business. So if you're turning open source into a sustainable business, there's got to be, okay, well, the sustainable business has to come from selling something. So what are you selling, right? And every organization, even a university is essentially selling something. What they're selling are tuitions and then grant, like their revenue streams to a university are tuition and grants, and then they get money from endowments. They'll have some potentially donations that come in, from either donors or so. Like, one of the things that's helped me in terms of having to run several businesses is just almost think very pragmatically about what does the profit and loss look like, and then the balance sheet. Like, those are two fundamental accounting, bookkeeping activities, but every business has one. Every business has and every division of a business could have one too.
Every well-run business has
every
one.
well-run business. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Correct. And you have activities that don't have that, but a well-run business has a profit and loss. It's very simple. Now, they can be complicated, especially because I think one of the things that I learned, I didn't know starting in, was the role of accounting in business, right? And the accounting is about, at the end of the day, accounting is figuring out what bucket something falls in. You organize your expenses and your income into different buckets, and then you have a report that shows where they go. And there's double entry accounting. There's a whole system of doing that to help reduce errors. So people actually put it in the right place, and there's an accountability and an audit trail, so you can actually see, did I make a mistake? And what that does is just say, this is what I spent money on. This is where the money came from. You have to organize it. Now, that doesn't do anything in terms of, well, what's my point? Why am I doing this? And so that I understood accounting from that perspective, but then, my business is about organizing my income and expenses to achieve something. So every business I've run at this point has had an income stream. Here's the money coming in. Then you have the cost of goods sold. What's the cost to produce that? If you're selling that product, what's the cost of shipping the product? Then you have operating expenses. So you have two kinds of expenses. It's not going to detail about that. But essentially, you have income, expenses. The result has to be positive long term, right? It has to be positive over some time scale. If it's negative, basically, if you have no savings, it has to be positive right away, because otherwise you don't have any money. You out of business. But it can be negative for a little while if you've got some investors. If people are saying, yes, we'll fund the losses here because we believe that long term the growth will happen. I mean, this is all just basically, but it's stuff that I really didn't have a handle on when I was an academic, because I had put budgets together, but it was I was aware of it distantly. But there's nothing like essentially having to pay the expenses, receive the income, make sure the business doesn't go out of business, to really put a fine point around what a sustainable business is, like how that has to work, right? And it is important to understand that is complicated by the investor class. Right, there is a lot of investors out there who are willing to backstop businesses for some time. Like, businesses can actually they can be losing money for a decade, 20 years. As long as you either have to have customers, donors, or investors. And each of those have different expectations you're managing. Anyway, this is just maybe meta, but to me, it covers the breadth of the kinds of things you're trying to build if you want to build a business. You're basically building a P&L, and you have to have revenue streams and investors or donors. Right?
I think there's yes, but actually I have lots of comments on some of the things you said in the middle there, because I think what you've described, there's nothing wrong in what you've said.
Sure.
And yet I think there are a number of pieces which are metaphysically low dimensionality for what the full dynamics of what hits us in the open source ecosystem, what they really are, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that was the business side of it, and even there, it's very mechanical. It's very, very mechanically thought out. Like, businesses, the only way you get there is by organizing people enthusiastically around a concept to lead that. Like, you can't Like nobody starts a business by saying, "Hey, let's put a P&L together." And
Oh
that's
no, sure, but that's not that's yes, businesses of course are more than just the P&L, just like a body is more than its metabolism. But to your point, the metabolism has to net positive, or you die, right?
You die, right?
So,
exactly.
But my point more was just that when we many, and this is actually this is now less about open source, more about entrepreneurship.
Sure.
Many people who blossom into wanting to be entrepreneurs. The ones who are not LARPing it, but the ones who really actually want to go and create a business, do something valuable. Maybe they grew up in a household that, like an immigrant, a lot of immigrants, I think they grow up with like their family has some kind of small family business. So in our case, my dad was a professor, but we also had a real estate business on the side, rental real estate. So there's kind of this like startup entrepreneur hustle thing, which is you have some familiarity with. And then you get into doing business and you're like, okay, I understand that I have to have a product. I sell the product at a greater profit than I bought it for, right? Or I trade a service at, some markup, whatever it is. But that's, I would say, all still in this like layer one analysis of how the business world currently works around the area of software, right? Because that's all true, whether you're selling, lemonade at a fruit stand or at a lemonade stand, or whether you're selling software services. There's kind of that layer 0, layer 1 kind of analysis, which is the game as it's taught to people, the game as we sort of generally perceive it in the world, the game as people talk about it, even in like, MSNBC and other places in the business press. There's this kind of concept of here's the game, but there's actually many layers of games below that. And unfortunately, those dynamics project into this layer, and it really, I think, discombobulates people's thinking, right? So, and to be very concrete about what I mean is that what you alluded to this, right? When now you have investors coming in and they're speculating on businesses.
Yes.
At this point, the business ceases to be a classic business P&L sense kind of thing. It actually has to add it needs to do that. It does need to do that, but it also has this additional dimension it got upgraded to, which is it is now a speculative asset. In the capital class, in the investor and the speculation class. Okay. And so, as you can look at the shadow of an object moving in 2D on a 2D plane, that doesn't capture the dynamics. So once you upgrade it from a circle to a sphere 3D, now it's in all sorts of crazy stuff. I think this is a really important dynamic here. And
I agree, actually, because I think you described here's what a business is. Now here's the capital class that actually also is trying to make businesses for the future, but it changes the dynamics of the conversation, right? From strictly, I got to make money. I mean,
when you say they're trying to make business for the future, what do you mean?
Well, yes, the capital class also cares about P&L, but their time constant is different, right? Like that's what I mean. I mean, you may phrase it differently, but effectively, some
parts of them do. This is the weird thing. The capital classes consist of many players. Some are, and there's a game of hot potato of speculation all the way until it enters, the public markets generally. Right?
Yes.
So let's be honest about it, because this is what also hits us in the tech industry, and certainly for open source people.
I agree.
There are plenty of investors who actually don't give a rip about your P&L if they can pass you off to the next guy down the road.
Agreed.
Right?
This is an interesting question I've asked several people in terms of even the public markets. Like, what makes a stock valuable? Why would I want to buy that stock? Right. And ultimately, the biggest answer, 99.9% answer, is because I want to sell it to somebody else later for a profit.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
No, agreed. But why would somebody else buy it? Right.
Well,
at some point,
because they're dumber than you. I mean, it's information arbitrage, right?
No, yes, but at some point, there's got to be a reason somebody would hold an asset like a company. And
there's dividend-paying stocks. No, in the public markets, there's dividend-paying stocks.
I think it's in the public markets dividend, but it also can be control. Like sometimes people will do it because they want to get control. And those are anyway. This is getting into the weeds, but I think it's important because it does lead to different kinds of business decisions. As you're trying to turn open source into a sustainable business, you have to understand where your money's coming from, right? And is your money, and this is kind of, I think, part of what you're getting at, or I hope what you're getting at is that, I've described kind of, here's a fundamental way business, you make a profit, you sell to customers, you make a profit.
It's a 1950s textbook. What does a business do, right?
Exactly.
Right.
But and then on top of that, there are these layers that our modern system has added, some of which isn't it's basically a bit of a fact, you don't know. Like there's like a lot of, well, how does this work exactly? And we could talk for hours and maybe, I'd love to hear from your perspectives. This is definitely something you and I both have some experience with now, which we did not 15 years ago.
Well,
Right.
and 15 years ago, I would say the capital markets also changed in the sense that people did not understand what it meant to invest in open source businesses,
Yeah.
and not
Yeah.
just capital classes. I think there's also the corporate management classes and whatnot, as they look at how do they spend money on
Yeah.
technology. What is
Yeah.
the value in investing in open source?
Yes.
There's
Yes.
companies today which we sometimes run into who are like, well, we don't, is it safe to use open source? Can we use
Right.
open source? And it's
Right.
like literally
You
the
already-
world runs on open. What do you
You
think?
already are. You already are.
But the thing is, we
Yeah.
can laugh at it, but we can also just we can cry about it. But we have to sort of look at the cold hard reality, which
Yeah.
is that tremendous tens, hundreds of billions of dollars of IT budget are managed and controlled by people who don't know really what the leading edge
Okay.
of technology, what it can do, what it should do, what it can't do, and what it shouldn't do.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true for the LPs that fund the VCs, right?
Yes.
The
Yes.
LPs just want a rate of return.
Yes.
And the VCs,
Yes.
at some point, the way they get their
Yes.
rate of return is either by the greater fool theory, to your point about, hey, at some point you're buying this to sell it. Who are you selling it to? Well,
Right.
obviously not someone who you think is smarter than you, because if they were smarter than you, they wouldn't how does that work, right?
Well,
in some cases you do. Now
I
that being
would like.
said,
I mean, I don't think it's nearly as bleak as that. I mean, I know you don't either, but I mean, it's trade. Like, why does somebody want to buy? Like, if you're talking about acquiring a company entirely, like grabbing shares of a company is one question. Grabbing a company entirely, there's lots of reasons somebody wants to do that.
sure, yeah.
Right. There's, it's strategic. It helps me, my thing I'm trying to accomplish to lead to more profitability for my company. Like, ultimately, there's a lot of situations where, the one company acquires another, and then that acquires another, and then eventually there's another bigger company that acquires it. Like, that's happening all the time.
Right.
And then you have public markets, which is okay. Now individual companies are doing this. Yeah, we ought to figure out how to, like, maybe you could just make one comment, kind of, if you've made your, I don't know if you made your point that you were trying to make. I want to give you the chance to do that, and then we can start talking about specifics and how.
Sure,
it
let's get to the
specific
specifics.
models.
But I think it's really important to clear for people, because a lot of open source companies, a lot of open source developers are being approached, if that's successful
Yes.
projects, to
Yes.
take on capital.
Yes. Yes.
And they know less about this than you and I do. And
Yes.
maybe less than you and I did even 10 years ago.
Yes.
Which is why, it's sort of like, I don't know. It's sort of, there's an aspect of this which
I'm 100%
important.
on board
Anyway,
with you.
We're a little bit of a digression here, but yeah.
But I think the core point is currently there has been for about a few years, it's kind of tapered off, but there was like, popular open source project, somebody shows up with a big check to give it to you.
Right.
Right. And what is what's the other end of that check? I guess.
Well, I think this is maybe the final. This is still all down this rat hole of, why do people care about open source? And the people who actually write the code, and the people who show up on the mailing list on the GitHub to fix some obscure little problem, they care about that software artifact for different reasons. They have a different value system than a VC coming along, jamming $10 million into a dev team that has no idea how to manage people. Okay.
Yes.
And no idea how to grow, no idea how to sell. Right.
Yes.
And so there are different motivations for why energy flows into an open source project. So let's just now, long jump right back to where we started.
Yes.
How do we fund open source? Why do we fund open source? Why does it matter that open source is funded? Okay.
Yes.
And I think every single person, so my actual point on all this, before we kind of went down all this, thing about funding and all this stuff, my learning in a lot of this is that people themselves, oftentimes the developers themselves, are not actually so crisp in their thinking, or even intellectually honest with themselves about why they're doing a particular project.
Yeah.
And then why they want to start a business. Sometimes it's for the glory. Why do they want to go raise money? So they can tell their friends they raised money at this valuation, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of reasons why people do things that are maybe not what they would initially come out with, but are actually some of the motivators. And in the case of open source software, I think it's so important that we actually articulate the values of why people work on the code in a very clear way, because the non-aligned value system, or the alternative value systems, will try to hijack those dynamics to the extent they can to get energy for their particular reasons, right?
Perfectly said. And I think you agree. These alignments are not, there's not a moral judgment. It's just simply like there can be, but most of the time it's just simply different incentives. They have different alignments, and just being aware of them. And kind of what we're advocating, I think, is awareness of the alignment, so that you don't find yourself in a situation that you are not happy with 3 years from now. Your future you is
Right.
not happy about the situation you just created. And I would say
There's a moral judgment at the end. We don't have to get to it right now.
Correct. And that's kind of the point is, can we help people at least have enough information to make decisions about what their intent is? And probably the message is, be clear of your intent and recognize it might change, and that's okay. Like, nobody's claiming you gotta be the same person throughout your entire life. Like, you will have different goals and values, but just try to be clear about what they are, and then understand as best you can if there's alignment with the funding to enable that business.
So let's walk through some concrete things here, right?
Exactly.
Let's say you and I, Travis, we make a project, and it's a great project. We like working on it. You've currently got a job. I've got a job. And we work on this project, and nights and weekends we're hacking on it. It's kind of neat. We find some other users, people who like working on this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a little robot thing, or maybe it's a piece of software to do some random thing or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets more popular. And then at some point, let's say we decide, hey, you know what? We could do a lot more with this project if we were to go and work on it full time.
Perfect.
Okay, because we're time limited now.
Exactly.
We have enough users. You hit some threshold. Usually the first threshold is you hit. Yeah, this is actually kind of like a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram of like the evolution of projects. Okay, so so you start off with a certain core adopter user base, and then maybe a user says, "Hey, I'm using your project for this thing at work. Like, can I pay you guys $1,000 to fix this bug?"
Right.
And maybe that starts happening over and over. Or a big company comes by and says, "Hey, we'd like this thing done. Can we contract with you guys to implement this thing for $100,000?" Now, maybe I'm a software developer and I'm only making $120,000 a year anyway, and I'm like, "Whoa." Right. Now, this is how many of others of those companies are there out there? This is oftentimes the origin story for people who want to do a startup around their labor of love. Okay.
Yes.
So now let's look at some of the different pathways that could happen. Okay.
Right.
And the questions we don't know. Let's take this back to like Peter and Travis at age 30. Like, what do we not know? Right. The questions that are important to ask is, well, how many other people are there like that? How much money could I make? Right. If I quit my current job, what is the downside, like the opportunity cost? Could I come back to a job like that in the future if this doesn't work out? I mean, if it's a two-way door versus a one-way door, then it's a lot easier to go through it and say, well, you know what? I tried this thing, did the startup for a couple of years, didn't work, came back with more experience and got a higher salary anyway. Those are all perfectly valid routes. And I would say, actually, back to the moral judgment thing, we should encourage people not to see these as horrible failures, right? Like,
no, exactly.
These are valid paths in your life and your growth as a software developer. And it's possible that your project you made, and again, no moral judgment, but it's possible the open source project you and I work on, it's only really good for a few years. And then something else comes along and it's like, it's not really necessary anymore, right? So all these things, it's just to really want to tell people it's your labor of love. It may seem like a big life decision to change jobs. It always is. But at the end of the day, you're probably going to be okay. As long as you're learning and you're building something and you're really, not soullessly just like working for the man. You're really doing something that you care about. I think, good things can happen. I'm fundamentally an optimist, right? So anyway, so we can start a business, and now here's the problem. We're motivated to start the business because a few dollars came walking in the door to us, right? But now the question of how do we get the next dollars? How do we find the next customers? This whole topic of go to market. How do we take our project to a market? That is a whole topic.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. All of a sudden, that's a concept that before you weren't even thinking about. And now
you have organic adoption, Hacker News, whatever.
You got inbound coming, more than I can handle. And as an individual, great. And basically, if you've got a job and you can do nights and weekends of a supplement of that job, doing consulting for people that come inbound, that's not a bad gig, right? And honestly, for many people, they might just do that, right? And that's fine. Right.
That's one of the paths on Hertzsprung-Russell. Many consultancies built sustainable people with second homes.
Well, let's talk about the difference between a single person, you having a job and then taking gigs on the side, then eventually doing gigs full time as a person, and then joining to create a consultancy where now you're doing that for 5 people, or maybe 10 people, or maybe 100 people. Like, because each of those has a different, and they're all in the same bucket, but they're different in the terms of, like, if it's just you and you've got a full-time job, you don't really need to worry too much about going and getting more business because you've got your income, again, depending, and you have to look at your own situation. Some people are in a situation where, like, I've got an income stream for my own personal expenses. I don't need more money. I'm just looking, and so I'm once, and for most open source developers, I would say it's not that you don't do it because you're looking for more money. Like I would say, in fact, that's the antithesis of people get involved with open source. People get involved with open source because they might be looking for more fame, they might be looking for more connections. But the reason open source succeeds is because the vast majority of people that do open source are looking for either connection or impact or learning or knowledge, or kind of, they like building together something that's bigger than themselves. And that's a lot
Well, I
of
would
what
say
drives
that
people
is
to get into open source.
the high virtue set. There are plenty of people who get into
No,
it for the
agreed.
glory and for the dollars now, right? And
No,
unfortunately, that's
well,
the darker side
I think
of
it's
it
growing.
now.
I think, and I totally admit that side exists, but it's growing. But usually, it leads to suboptimal outcomes. Doesn't last very long, right? It's sort of, maybe it comes in and it kind of flows away. And then watching projects over the course of 20 years, you have a lot of, we have insight in terms of, okay, which sustained, which didn't, where was the energy coming
Right.
from, where was the flow coming from, and it's really from that perspective that I'm trying to understand. What are ways to do this now? Concretely, okay, that is one way. I think that is one category of business that will work and will continue to work at different scales. Basically, you're selling your time. You say, here's open source. You want some more support? You want some help? Here's some time. And there's a whole conversation we can have, and I think we can push it. If you want to figure out how to build a business like that, get in touch. Actually, that's what I do. I help people build consulting businesses. So come talk to me, and we'll help you. And even just a half-hour conversation, and we can, or even we might help you even more fully. But we can have that conversation. So if you want to start a consultancy around your open source project, I can walk you through that and the ups and downs and the challenges that may exist.
Yep. It's
right,
much more. There's so much there.
There's so much there.
But your question about what happens when you add the second person.
Yes.
And I think there's actually something worth noting here, which is that whether you're in business around open source or you're in business, period, like we could be starting a laundromat together, Travis.
Yes.
When you add another person, there's a fundamental thing of like, now you're relating to someone who's not in your own head, right?
Yes.
And who actually doesn't share your own heart. And just from a point of like moral virtue, like there's something you owe to them, right? That you can't just say, well, you know what, I'm gonna I kind of want to go and just like hike the Alps for a while. So I'm just going to shut the business down for 3 months and go do that. Because your other, maybe your partner, your business partner is expecting to have a baby, and they need to like queue up a lot of money so they can take some time off once they have the baby.
Yeah,
right?
No, that's an excellent
all of these things.
Yes.
Once you bring other people in, regardless of what you're doing, open source aside, once you start working with other people in some kind of capacity where you have not just a contractual obligation, but just a moral and ethical obligation to the other person, or people, right?
There's an implied obligation.
There's an implied obligation, right? I mean, yes, you could always just be an a-hole who leaves people hanging, but let's not do that, right? But in any case, the point is, when you're starting a business of any sort, you have this kind of thing when you go from single person to multi-person, sole proprietorship to multi-person partnership, to then actually building something of a corporation or a larger business that has a management structure. Businesses are hard, full stop.
Yeah,
building open source businesses has a whole nother like 10 dimensions of hard on top of it. But ultimately, some of the things that we are talking about, like what happens when you add another person to the project, what happens when you add 10 or 20 people to an open source project, the governance needs and the need to concretize the values and the norms of that human collaboration is no different than it is in a business. They're actually very similar, right?
I agree with you.
It's not about the money. It's just about people being people.
I totally agree with you, Peter. And I think that's an important understanding is there's not some magic thing that happens when you talk about business versus open source. There's different incentives, alignments, and participants. And essentially you just being aware of those and making sure your organization is intentional, as intentional as you can be. You can't map out everybody. You're not trying to map out everybody's heart and value system. What you're trying to do is find the alignment space. This is where we are, and then people can come to that space with bring their full, as much of themselves as they're willing to bring to that space to have that, to pursue that together. Totally agree. Now, I think there's some specifics of so we talked about consulting businesses, definitely. I think there's a question actually about from Paul about when do you make a business, when do you start something like a foundation, and how do they differ?
Right.
So honestly, we have some conversation. We can talk about this to quite a bit of degree because we were involved. Both of us were involved in creating NumFocus, a foundation. And I can talk about the reasons we did a foundation and a business. We did two at the same time. We pulled both of them, and they helped each other initially, right? I mean, most people aren't aware, but NumFocus was sitting in Continuum Analytics. The business we were building. We had, people working for NumFocus that were on our payroll. Like we were actually,
we underwrote and bootstrapped that.
Bootstrap NumFocus, right? And said, look, let's try to make this happen. And I would say a foundation is a very different organization. And for me, the reason to have a foundation was because to clarify ownership of certain IP. Like, we had just come from a business where we were involved in open source. We had the SciPy community, associated with Enthought. And I wanted to clarify Continuum Analytics, essentially rights or perspective, or how it was trying to organize itself around NumPy, which is the project I started, and SciPy, which at that point had been kind of muddied in terms of its IP ownership with the business that started alongside it. So I just wanted I wanted clarity, and really that was the purpose of NumFocus, was because I didn't want people to think that now every open source project that I get involved with is going to somehow just be part of this business. Like, some might, and in fact we did. Continuum Analytics had some projects that were Continuum Analytics projects,
right?
And then several of them have gone, have now become NumFocus more sponsored community sponsored projects or community driven projects. But I wanted that dynamic. Like, to me, that was the importance of the foundation. So that's why we started the foundation. And then foundations can do different things, but they have similar problems. Like, it's not, you start a foundation, it's still an organization. Somebody has to run it. Somebody has to, has to manage it. There's it's still a thing, right? That somebody has to make decisions around.
Well, we just say, like, pound include normal problems of human organization.
Yes.
In any organization,
yes.
Pound include, right?
Pound include, exactly.
But that aside, the specific challenges that are addressed by a business versus a foundation, it comes down to the purpose. Really, very simple. And I think even for open source projects as well.
Yeah.
Purpose. And there's a framework that a good friend of mine sort of taught me a few years ago that has just been absolutely fantastic. And he encouraged separating the world and looking at the world from different ways. There's the way of looking at the world that is instrumental, that is about doing and achieving objectives and kind of very goal-oriented in this way. And Travis, you started the AMA today with some exposition about that, about the goals and the achieving the goals and all these things. And then there's also so that's an instrumental or goal-oriented way, and the other is the value-based way, which is looking at what are the values, and values are lived values, they're expressed values. They're not really goals like to achieve, to say, oh, well, I've achieved being a good person, now I can do whatever I want, right? No, being a good person is the thing you are, right? You try to live to certain values and virtues. Now with goals, though, foundations, and actually this is a big differentiator, if you will. Like, a lot of open source projects they're somewhat goal oriented. They want to get a release out, they want to fix a bug, but a lot of it is about manifesting certain values, technical values, technical merit, quality, excellence, efficiency, correctness, what have you. And that is a draw for us. And I think this is the fact that it is a values manifesting kind of activity versus is more about being than about doing, versus businesses and foundations, any kind of human organizations. If you want to have a coherent human structure, humans need purpose. So when people get together, the group needs purpose. And so now you've got to actually be very, very explicit about, why are we spending our time together here today? Oh, we're all gonna make a lot of money, that's why, right? Or why are we getting together to do this foundation? Oh, because together we pull our expertise, we can go and get a lot more money to make this change in the world, right? But it's still very goal-oriented. So I think foundation versus business, it's just the different goals that you actually want to spend your time doing. Most foundations, you're not going to make as much money as if a business was successful, but foundations, you can feel more like a lot of your time is spent towards that explicit goal that you're trying to do, versus businesses. And here's the interesting thing. This is kind of a callback to earlier in the conversation today, but most businesses, as they get successful, they will attract investors.
Yes.
And this idea that the stuff comes inbound at you is the same thing as when you start an open source project. Travis and Peter's excellent, whatever, Robo Vacuum little, Arduino hacked operating system thing. You can attract users, they throw some money at you, that's fine, that's money. It's a transaction, you take the money, you do the work, you're done. But when you get investment, when you get capital, das Kapital, right? When you get capital from investors, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. You're playing a different game. You're now upgrading yourself, your organization, and your project into assets in a capital market. And a lot of developers, like developer nerds, are not fluent in the dynamics and the rules of the game there. So I would say that if you want to build a business and you don't really care to attract capital at a level that would allow the capital to govern what you do, then you're do whatever you want with your business. You could just shutter it for 6 months out of the year and go hiking the Alps. Probably not a bad way to live life, honestly. But, once you get to a certain point, if capital becomes available, now here's the other interesting thing about having a human system together is that maybe the other people that you're working with want to take on the capital. They want a shot. They want to take a new shot. They want to try to double the business every year for the next 5 years. With some capital, maybe you could. And if you're an operator of a business at scale, surely you can look around and say, wow, there's like 5 dumpster fires I could put out if I had another $1 million or $2 million, right? So it's not that people do this just totally naively. There are reasons and reasons.
For sure.
But for open source projects and sustainable open source projects, this is the important thing. What makes an open source project sustainable is that, in my view, is that it has this continuous coherent thread of vision and of value and of purpose in that human collective organization.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yes, definitely.
And so if capital or if business concerns come injecting into that in a way that disrupts that or hijacks it, I would say that's that's
the meta, right? No, I would say that's the articulation of the problem that we're seeking to avoid in turning open source sustainable business. You've articulated, I think, why we're having this conversation, because it is true. The incentives, the goals, the orientation of a business or a foundation, actually, any organization that has a human element can interfere with the goals of the project. Again, they don't have to. You can find alignment. You can. That's actually what I find thrilling about the discovery, about the whole process. That's what I found I really resonate with and love, is actually finding alignment between the goals of different organizations that enable open source to thrive and enable those businesses to thrive. I would say that's exactly what I think is possible. But there are also things, it doesn't always work, right? It does go bad. It does go wrong. Things go wrong. I would say misalignment occurs.
Well, I think
people find themselves at different places.
The misalignment, from what I can see, the biggest issue really is that there's different kinds of open source development, to be clear, right? Yes. Much of the open source world that we worked in, Travis, right?
Yes.
We were tapped into a network of very, very busy scientists and associate professors and professors, grad students who are doing different kinds of things. They had time pressure. They were trying to build things to solve their own problems for a research proposal or to process data from some piece of equipment. And so this ecosystem got built out in parts by people trying to achieve very concrete goals. They were not sitting to build the world's greatest middleware. It was like, no, they had things they were trying to get done. You had things you're trying to get done, right?
Right.
Of course, you sat down and built some of the world's most important middleware. So maybe you're exactly the wrong person to talk about this. NumPy literally runs the world. You took a year out of your life to do that with the goal of trying to heal over an ecosystem that was splintering, right? Yeah. So you're really the one, maybe the exception that proves the rule. For the most part, people didn't do that. For the most part, people are sitting there building just,
there were other examples of this, particularly in our ecosystem of, the Matplotlib emergence, the Python Jupyter emergence, Pandas emergence. Like you sort of scikit-learn, like we saw this happen a few times with kind of from a similar perspective, I would say. Like I would say not very dissimilar, right, in terms of where they came from. But to your point,
the alignment, right?
It's happening differently now. There's different other projects that are happening now. They're have different origin stories.
Right. Well, it's not just the origin stories, but my point was going to be that the big difference in alignment is in general in open source ecosystems, the release clock is set by kind of when it's ready or when we found something interesting or when we finished completing a certain thing. Yes. So in our ecosystem, it was this like slime mold or this rhizomatic exploration of a possibility space and all this stuff. We did have a forcing function. Like I said, people needed to get their research done that did cause releases to get popped out on a regular basis. But on the whole, it was an exploration at the liminal frontier of what was possible to do with Python or was efficient or whatever. It was this very parallel, like you see the slime mold, right? Like this parallel route kind of exploration of what's possible at the edge of possible. Now, the problem is when you bring capital into this picture, okay, the entire world of the capital markets operates on the function e to the x, right? Everything is pegged to an internal rate of return and an interest rate.
Yes.
And if you take capital from people in a particular funding class, they expect a certain rate of return, maybe directly from you, ideally, or generally they'll be managing a portfolio of things of you and others like you. And overall, the bulk portfolio is supposed to return this thing. But it is not acceptable to say, well, we'll release the software when we think it's ready. It's no, you're releasing the software at this date because you need to get these sales, to get these numbers, to get this kind of growth, so we can show a IRR or a compounded growth that's this, because you took money from this tranche that we'd allocated that was supposed to return this percentage growth.
Yes.
It's that simple. And again, there's no moral judgment on this. I'm simply describing. This is descriptive, not normative. I'm describing when you take funding, when you play in the capital markets, which altitude level you're at. You can almost actually really do it as a stack. Are you at the 5% internal rate of return, the 10%, 20, 50? Where are you, right?
Right.
Because ultimately the LPs are going to the VCs and saying, here's $1 billion, make us more than 5%, right?
And there's a time scale and a grouping. Like, because you described, like, there's a time scale. Is this over, how much time do you have to show this? Is it 1 year, 3 years, 7 years, 10 years? Is it, and then also it's how are you grouped? Oh, I'm one of 500, I'm one of 10, I'm one of 5. Like, just, it'll illustrate the pressures that are behind the scenes. So even if the particular funder you have isn't directly giving you those pressures, it's helpful to understand what pressures they're feeling, because it'll come through eventually. Like, at some point,
I would say that the only reason they're not giving those pressures is not because the pressures don't exist, but because they don't want to scare the bunny. Right?
Exactly.
They need you to. They want to keep this relationship with you and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, an investor is not an investor if they're not looking for a return by definition, like almost at a Merriam-Webster level. Right?
Exactly.
So
that's why So I think that's important to understand. Now, there's a number of good questions I want to get to.
Okay. Yes.
So, anything else you want to say to that point before we do? So I'd love to clear these questions. Okay. So, maybe before we get there, we can just say the different kinds of companies. Maybe we can just 30 seconds. There's consulting companies. There's a product company. That's product could be a SaaS product, it could be an enterprise product. What else would you say? And then foundation.
I would say there's also the consultancies. There's different kinds as well. There's like the very small scale kind of things. Someone has particular expertise, and that expertise may only be relevant for some period of time. Like fruit, it's got a shelf life. The world does move on, and so in these different areas where open source can lead to successful business models, the only way you stay relevant for a long time is if you can attract enough resources to fund continued development and innovation in the core technology itself. So this is all about different routes of monetizing technology. There are a few players that have done ecosystem level plays. Like Anaconda was one, Red Hat is one. Most often companies that do open source, companies that are launched with the early stage, like open source product thesis, oftentimes that is sort of this freemium model, which was mentioned, I think, in Pablo's question, right? Those kinds of sole vendor open source, like the people who contributed to the team, like the open source team that made the project, that know how it works, that own the vision. They alone own the vision. You can put an MIT or Apache 2 license on the code base in GitHub, but the project is defined by like 5 people who are all founders of this like company. Then yes, it's open source, but is it open innovation? And is it forkable and all these other kinds of things, right? That's not to say, again, not a moral judgment. It's not that it's not open source, but just that the business model around that, when you then go to market, when you go to market, then what you'll find is that the reason a lot of businesses are buying open source is because they have internal developers that are able to use and try the thing without having to go through a procurement process. They use it, they like it, and now it's taken root internally. So a lot of the B2B software in the infrastructure, data management, data processing, enterprise widgets kind of space, that B2B software motion that's become very, very popular is they use open source as a shortcut and a hack around the terrible corporate procurement processes for software technology.
Yeah, it's true.
Right. And that's like the cool, that's how they do the Kessel run in 12 parsecs. And that's the motion there. So that is, yes, a valid and
so open source as procurement hack.
No, but exactly.
Procurement hack, yes.
Well, so was cloud. Cloud was also a procurement hack, right? Oh, the entire category of B2B SaaS software was a hack around procurement.
So I think that's interesting. But there are those meta opportunities that exist around open source. That's true. And then there's sort of the practical. So freemium. Go back to the freemium. A lot of them do use a freemium. I like here to comment on my. I prefer to talk about a related product. Yes, because you can have a freemium model where you have a related product that's for free, and then you start charging it, and separate that from the open source that it may depend on. Like things usually work a lot better if you have an open source project and then it's a dependence, then you use it to produce a product, as opposed to having a product that's also open source and some, if you had a grid and you said, here's our offerings, open source, and then you start paying and that's all in the same grid, it can be a little challenging, I argue, for creating, for aligning the ethos of people that want to participate, because then people get confused as to what they're building and why. Wait, am I building part of your product? It makes it hard to build community around it, honestly. Whereas you can actually say, look, we're going to sponsor this infrastructure piece that's open source and let it evolve as it might. But then here's our product, and then that product, it might. Even then, it's almost not even. It doesn't even matter if it's open source. This is my personal opinion, but I prefer the complementary product line. Open source as potentially a lead generator to a complementary product, and then that typically you do have to have an entry point to the product that's lower cost or free to get people to use it, and then it has its own story. And then open source adoption, you want to tie. I mean, this is just my perspective on what I think works long term. And it lets you separate the concerns so that you can find alignment among the different participants. So you can have an authentic conversation with anybody that's coming to the open source ecosystem, and you don't have to also pull them into the product releases of your product. The product team doesn't have to also, they can be aware of what's going on in open source. They don't have to be in the same meetings, the same groups, the same conversations. What's interesting over time, and this is my observation, Peter, you can comment to see, if you see the same thing or not. I have observed that it's almost like there's different motions when you're trying to put a product out, and the team that builds a product and the things that work and the way they cohere and the way they work together. There's obviously it's development, so some of it's common, but it's interesting over time. It seems like there's different mindsets. The open source, exploration of the space for its own, for its own sake and not having constraints, versus products have to be released. You do have to have some, roadmap when it's released. What's the story? And so people that have worked well on product teams often haven't worked well on open source projects, and vice versa. People that do really well on open source projects have tried to put them on a product team, and it doesn't go so well. It's like almost the same, like the capability set or the things that make them really successful in one versus the other are not shared. They're not the same set of.
Well, I think I understand why you say that, Travis, but I think that we're maybe conflating two different axes, which is the maturity of the project at all. There are plenty of open source projects that are exceptionally mature, that are well managed with a release cadence, maintenance releases, all these things. And there are people who are going to be okay and actually not just okay and happy, but they thrive in a more structured environment like that, right? Versus then there's people who want to do exploratory work and they just want to try something new and they don't want to have to ask a bunch of people's permission, et cetera, right?
There are open source projects that actually have more product-like teams, like PyTorch, for example, is an example of a product of an open source project that it's like a product that Meta is releasing, right? And the people, and I agree with you on things. Yes, I agree with you like that. However, PyTorch also struggles with community adoption, with getting more people participating and developing the ethos.
You mean with attracting community participants, not adoption in terms of users?
No.
I think they're okay on the user adoption part.
They're totally fine on the user adoption part. No, it's and again, this is not a moral judgment, just an observation of, and so I think to clarify, if you want to build a project that gets community adoption, you have to do things that are different than just putting releases out and then having and making sure that the product is good. It's a necessary condition, but you look at the projects that get wide community adoption, or not adoption, wide community participation and contributor groups. They look different. And I've seen this several times, right? Try to put people on projects to move it forward, and they do a good job of doing the work, but they don't do a good job of engaging with the community. And
I guess I just don't feel like there's necessarily such a. I mean, I could see why. I want to disambiguate between the people, like how you manage a community-oriented process from the maturity of a project, right?
No, but I don't think that's the only dimension, personally. Okay. So this is obviously something we have to dive into a little more. We have a slightly different point of view. I don't think that's exactly the right framing. Yes, it's important. Maturity of project matters. I'm talking about the person on the project, how they're managed and what they contribute to the project, if you're looking for community participation, you have to be
Right.
intentional about it. And
Yes, I
so
agree with that. I agree
and
with
so
that.
and so
Yeah.
and the people to help you be intentional about that may not be your product developers, may not be your product managers. It's just it could be.
Well, product managers and product developers are two
They
very different
they
things,
are they
right?
are, and I mean both actually. Um,
Okay.
people that are really good at making progress towards technical innovation are not the same people that are good at helping communities participate and
Um,
communication about that.
are not necessarily the same ones, but in
Not
both
necessarily.
cases, so yeah, like I just really want to disentangle some of this stuff because I don't want what I don't want to do. The reason I care about this is I don't want to end up in a well, we're conflating the like there are people who do open source development who are quite senior and experienced who are I think very good product developers in the sense that they are ruthlessly very pragmatic about their time and what should and should not go into the project and what can be done, right?
I totally
I think you agree
agree.
with that point.
I
And
totally
so
agree.
I call that kind of person a product developer.
Fair
And I
enough.
think you're using that term to mean something different than what I mean by that term.
Fair enough.
Right?
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I am talking about smaller, like at larger scale. A lot of this becomes roles you need for any larger scale project to succeed, and then the
Mm-hmm.
roles have to, and then there's essentially a dozen roles. Whereas when you're talking about a small project, all dozen roles are typically filled by one person.
Right.
And then the challenge, and that's actually a challenge because then that person
Mm-hmm.
ends up having different things they have to do, and some of which they're very good at, and some of which they're not very good at.
Right. If
So
you're
I think
hiring
that's
someone to augment that team and they only have 2 out of
yes,
5 of the bits filled in, then then your project is getting 2 out of the 5 vitamins it needs, and it then suffers in community growth because of no. So I think we're in agreement on that.
That's all I'm saying is this is important to understand. It's not just a single open source is not a single track of activity. Now, sorry about that. I think one question, would we invest in a tech company that didn't have an open source component for the market? So I would say I would. Like I separate those two. I separate investment in a project from having to do open source. Like companies I invest in don't have to do open source. I am interested in understanding how they think about open source. Like, are they going to be able to, are they just depending on it and not thinking about how they're going to long-term depend on it? Or are they, is it a minor use of open source? I don't require companies I invest in to have an open source project that they promote or develop.
Yeah, for me, open source is one of the many sort of values and ethos sort of frameworks that I care about.
Yeah.
And so if a company is if it advertises itself as working in that domain, then I want to make sure it's credible in that domain in the sense that I care about it, right?
Yeah.
But if it's not in that domain, then if it's doing something else that I care about, then it does something else that I care about. And open source sort of orthogonal to that. So I don't have
So this is a good question we got from the Open Teams community was if you have a co-founder, is it better to have someone who sees eye to eye with you or someone who's different, has a different perspective to help keep balance? It's a good question, right? Peter, what do you think?
I think the question it would be hard to answer the question as posed because I think I think it's good to keep balance. I will agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think on certain key things, if you have difference of perspectives, the project falls apart. So they have to be aligned with you on certain core things, right? So I guess it's not for me. It's not just a single scalar. Like, are they aligned or are they misaligned? But my comment on would be to the extent that you are able to discern and be aware and honest with yourself about what you're good at and what you like and what you really care about versus what you can let go of. The more you are able to know that about yourself, the better you'll be able to find other people who are good complements for you.
Yeah.
And this never ceases, like whether it's the first, whether it's your co-founder or your first few employees or your 100th or 1,000th employee, it's the same thing, right?
Yeah,
so
I agree. I think it's important to understand this is the uniform problem of human team organization,
right?
And their co-founder is just the early stages of that. And I would say the most important thing is can I commit to this person and can we work together regardless, right? And that has sometimes, yes, it's about complementary and can you add skills together, but I'd say it's more important, can we do we value each other, can we work together, because you can find other people to help complement you as needed. Like that is a solvable problem. You can't solve co-founders that are at odds with each other, right? That end up being pulling to different directions.
Yeah, and I think any
from a
kind of
value
co-founder
from a value
situation,
perspective.
I think maybe the most dangerous thing, maybe to as a corollary for this or a second part B answer, if you find someone who really sees eye to eye with you and you feel like, wow, this is great, you should take extra time to find and explore when you hit the boundary of disagreement.
Yeah,
Because it is extremely unlikely that you guys all see eye to eye on everything.
On everything. Yeah.
And if you've not had your first fight yet about something, then you better do it, as soon as possible.
It's actually true.
Let's just hope it's something like the color of the couch in your office, like something really silly that doesn't matter. If it's something really foundational, then hey, you should figure that out early, right?
Right, exactly. I would say that's more important. Is how what's it like? What's going to be like to argue and disagree with this person, and how are you going to resolve that? Right.
Yep.
And that's one of the key things, I think, for sure. Okay, awesome. Well, I love this conversation. I
always love chatting with you, Travis.
We can talk for a long time because
fun.
there's a lot of these questions. I mean, where else people talking about this? Because it's happening under our noses. It's happening I've just been floored, frankly, by this little stuff we were doing 20 years ago, and now, I actually remember a talk I was giving 12 years ago, or when we started Team Analytics. We were in Google, the Googleplex, and we were concerned about the takeover of JavaScript and Java in the world. And I didn't want to be writing Java code to do array computing, right? That was one of the things we were concerned about. Well, I can safely say that's no longer a concern.
Yep.
Right.
You're gonna write Mojo instead, right, Travis?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Maybe. I mean, the concern now is more subtle. It's more about, I'm writing that kind of Python code. Like the level of complexity of code has gotten so big with so many people participating that it's actually it can be very daunting. Right. Some of the things we thought of as were straightforward extensions of our story are now, oh man, there's this deep C++ integration with that and with that. And you look at actual models in production today, and they're quite sophisticated in terms of our what we had imagined. It's totally doable and totally, it works. That's cool, right? But I would say there's a lot of opportunity for continuing to improve. I think one of the things I observe, you can comment to this, Peter, is I think as software becomes more about configuration, like more about, here's some modules that work together, that stitch together. Software is always going to be there. I am not advocating that software developers will somehow go out of style. They won't be needed. Not in my lifetime. We are going to be, I think what they do will be different. I think a demand for more capability is going to be there. Like right now, for example, there's a massive shortage of compiler people. Like people that actually know, there's a lot of demand for, compiling Python stacks. And there are not many people that can actually do that work, right? So right now, in particular, that's a great place to get some understanding. Now, will that be there in 10 years? I don't know, right? But it's a need right now. But there'll be other things people need. But I think one thing is definitely happening as it becomes easier to stitch together tools to produce solutions. What is always available is the business. Like, why are people investing in software? Many companies keep buying software and hardware to solve a business problem,
right?
And that business problem has, and we say business problem. It's not one thing. They're like literally 10 to 100,000 different kinds of business problems. As many businesses there are, so millions actually of business problems. And it's not, while there's certain commonalities in how they're expressed, most organizations, they'll buy a tool and then they'll have to spend a bunch of money to help the tool be useful for them. And so when open source emerged, it became kind of I can just make this useful for me on open source. And so now they have custom solutions internally that solve their business problem. But now they're maintaining that. Like, the demand for domain expertise is going to continue. So this is one of my advice. My advice to starting a business is, what domain are you helping? Like, yes, you might be, here's a tool for a bunch of people. I'm saying that there's a lot of need for solving domain problems. And those businesses may not be as, they're not as scalable. You can't get the investor class because it's not $1 trillion idea or $1 billion idea.
Right.
But there's a lot of $100 million ideas that are out there. There are a lot of
them. So I think that for me, it's this, wow, so much to build on, and we're out of time, unfortunately. I would just say this thing, which is, I think the nature of what software is going to evolve. I don't think it'll go away entirely, but I think it'll be radically different. And software as a category emerged. I'm basically as old as software. So you're looking at me, the manifestation of how old software is. But no, software as a commercial thing that people could do. Actually, software as IP is just a couple years older than me. Copyright Act 1976. So it emerged in a time when you had capabilities that people needed to harness, which was the hardware computer. Those all had compilers and they had programming languages on them, but most people couldn't learn how to write those programs. So you end up with data systems, hence, people like Larry Ellison could buy islands. And then you ended up with these kinds of software sitting on top of things, various levels of abstraction. But as we're moving into this new world where we have this magical technology with neural nets at scale, we can now actually go directly to the end user with their, and this is where I disagree with you, Travis. I think there's a billion business problems at least, minimum.
Fair.
Right, those end users, because they have a different one every day. They have a different one every day.
Yes, I agree with you.
So all those billions of people have their own point of view.
Underestimate.
Well, they have their own point of view on what they want to do and what they want to solve, and they can actually now interface with something that can go from informal human, loose semantics and colloquialisms down to actual precision computable things. So this top-down approach to building information systems, most of which are either reporting or they are. Oh my God, is that really loud for you guys?
Yeah, there it goes. It's dissipating.
Yeah,
but this is critical. You're making your final point.
I'm making my final point. Yeah, hold on a second.
I appreciate everybody joining us. This has been really, really fun.
That is the harbinger of doom. At the end of Peter loses his ability to make the point. All I was going to say was just that with LLMs and with AI technology, our ability to empower end users to build what they want and do open innovation, that for me is the heart of open source that we have to carry forward. And there's many things they'll try to close over that, and many things they'll try to do extractive business models around it. But there's something kind of the future of what open source is, I think ultimately is always about democratizing innovation and end user innovation and end user empowerment.
Beautiful. Well said. Awesome. I really appreciate everybody joining. There were some great questions asked. I know we didn't get to all of them. As you have more questions, please bring them. This is, Open Teams is sponsoring this conversation. Open Teams is an organization that we have community participation. This is free to join, an open source architect community, gathering people that are some experienced. If you're not, you need some experience in order to understand how to take open source and produce a solution like we're describing, that Peter, the billion of solutions that are out there, the potentials that are out there. We also have an open source solution community where we interact with people who have relationships with procurement providers. They're used to selling into organizations, talking about how do we actually help people use open source better. Then we have an engineering manager community. Join one of those communities. Reach us. You can reach Peter on X, on Threads, on actually, Peter, if you want to, how do people reach you? Would it be your email address or a DM?
Yeah, they can DM me on Twitter. I'm at P Wang. Yep. At
P Wang. Perfect. And then I'm Travis. You can ping me on Twitter X at T Oliphant, and also Travis at openteams.com. And if you are interested in building a business, we actually have an incubator at Open Teams. We're eager to talk to you and see if we can help. And there's specific ways we might be able to, and maybe we can't, but at least we can have a conversation. And I can be a cheerleader to help you navigate that world. That is my goal. I would like to help people share the mistakes I made, share the things I think I've learned, and you can take that and see if it helps you build your next big business, sustainable and business that makes you happy, makes you excited about the world. There's many of them to come. I'm grateful that you came today. Peter, thank you. And we'll look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much, Travis.
All right.
Yes.
Thanks,
next
everybody.
Time I'll schedule the jackhammering not in the window.
This happened to me multiple times. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to talking again.